The Mandalorian, Chapter 3. Hello and welcome to Hoeg's Postmortem discussion of Chapter 3 of Disney's The Mandalorian, subtitled The Sin. Now, if you're not familiar with our postmortem format, this is going to be a discussion of something we've already seen, so we're going to dive into spoilers pretty quick on this one. For non-spoiler information, it's a good episode, has a lot of good visuals, well-directed, a lot of interesting plot points. Again, not a lot of talking. But outside of those kind of overall concepts, we're really going to dive into the spoilers because everything else I want to say on this really relates to what the episode actually is. So we're going to go over some of the scenes, some of the plot points, and also talk about how it fits with the first two chapters and how chapters 1, 2, and 3 kind of make their own Star Wars movie in a very interesting way that leads us into episode 4, not actually knowing where this series is fully going to go. And that's a very cool feeling to have for a story that mostly plays it on the straight and narrow. This isn't a story about subverting expectations or about deconstructing the concept of a bounty hunter or what it means to be in a Star Wars universe where you're dealing with cantinas on the Outer Rim. This is a pretty straightforward story, but it still has surprises, and we still have that kind of sense of mystery about what the series, the remainder of the series, has left to unfold in a very, very cool way. With that out of the way as kind of broad strokes, I want to talk about this actual episode. Like the last episode in particular, this episode was actually pretty short, probably on the half-hour side of the spectrum. You once again have about a minute and a half of previously on footage, as well as some logo time for both Star Wars and then The Mandalorian itself. You have a pretty long credit sequence at the end. So Disney's making some interesting choices with this series. One gets the impression that they aren't fully on board or versed with what kind of streaming media delivery actually means. It's unusual to have a previously on for an original content creation for a streaming service. And the reason for that is because it's not just because Disney is keeping them for a week. It's also because if you want to watch The Mandalorian, it's exceedingly unlikely that you would just pop in and start with episode 3 and not watch episodes 1 and 2 because they're all in the same list. They're all available at the same place. It's not like watching network television when you might have caught an episode of Lost and not realize what had happened and not have a really good way to go and find out. It's a new age for this kind of thing. And I don't think Disney actually needs a minute and a half on the front end of their episodes before kind of diving into the action, but that's their own choice. But the overall result of that is that even when you go and you look and you see it's 36 or 37 minutes long, it's really closer to 31, 32 minutes. And while I think that's okay, I think it's good for streaming services to kind of build their episodes to whatever the appropriate length is for the story they want to tell. I will admit, as someone that purchased Disney Plus, that wants to see their originals, that has been very happy with The Mandalorian, I look at those times and say, wow, I had expected something that would be closer to 40 or 50 minutes of content, and that's not coming across. I think that's okay when you can deliver something like this, where it is enjoyable, you are getting some really fantastic visuals on a TV budget. But if in the future Disney makes an original and delivers it at 28 minutes, 29 minutes for an episode that you've waited a week for, and maybe it isn't hitting on all cylinders, it isn't pleasing everybody, I could see in the future how Disney could have an issue. But going into this episode itself, where we left the Mandalorian, he had gotten into a kind of side quest JRPG adventure on whatever planet he was on, which I said I thought might be Tatooine because of the presence of Jawas. Apparently it's not, as so the internet tells me. I don't know about that. But if it isn't, I will say I think that continues Star Wars issues with essentially making a very, very small universe. That you've got land speeders on all these different planets. Now you have Jawas on all these different planets. I would prefer, much like the prequels showed in the Star Wars universe, that essentially every planet has its own technology, has its own geography and its own environments and creatures. And I think the more that you kind of make different planets alike, the more you kind of shrink the Star Wars universe. But that's really a comment for the last episode. So the Mandalorian has escaped that planet with the Jawas and with his Yoda baby, and he is returning to the planet that we originally found him on to return him to Werner Herzog, the Imperial officer, the client, whatever you want to call him. I don't think he's otherwise been named. And he gets a call as he's returning him from his guild leader, which I believe is named Grief, says, hey, take him directly there. And we don't know whether he wants to eat him or hang him on his wall or whatever. That's your job as a bounty hunter. He was hired to bring this Yoda baby over there. And when you bring him, you walk away, you get paid. Everything's all good. Now, as we talked about in the last episode's Postmortem, we know that's not going to happen, that this narrative arc is really kind of structured to have the Mandalorian have a second of doubt about actually fulfilling this request for this Imperial, for these stormtroopers. I had said I thought maybe that was going to be the plot of the show, of the series, at least season 1. As it turns out, that's not correct. It was actually the plot of episode 3, which is actually very exciting because I thought they would draw it out. I thought they would draw out this kind of classic narrative, and they didn't. They got it all done when it made sense, when he was going to take it to this Imperial. He winds up taking it to the Imperial. You can see he's kind of got that second of doubt already because he was looking with some emotion, which is always very difficult to convey and also to kind of imply under a helmet with Baby Yoda when it was kind of playing with the knob or the toggle on his flight control stick before he landed. And when he turns him over, he gets paid this big bucket of steel just like he was promised, and the baby leaves the room, and then he does something unusual. The Mandalorian actually asks the question, what are you going to do with it? And Werner Herzog's character says, hey, that's not up to you. You're a bounty hunter. You fulfilled your bounty. I paid you up front. I paid you right now. Go away. We're not supposed to talk about this anymore, which sounds right. That sounds about right for how a bounty hunter in the Star Wars universe should operate. But just through that kind of dialogue and that thought process, we are once again kind of connecting with a character, which is so unusual when you have so little speech and so little kind of, you have absolutely no facial recognition. You can't actually empathize with this Mandalorian's face. It's so effective that it's very impressive. You know, I don't watch a lot of these things that kind of have this old Western vibe, very slow talking, very little revealed about the character, all revealed through action and not really that much through dialogue. And here you get that impression that the Mandalorian is really thinking twice about this. And he returns to what is called now, I think for the first time, the Covert, which is where the Mandalorians are hiding on this planet. And as he gives this steel to the armorer, she says she can do a lot of things with this steel because it's a ton of steel. And the other Mandalorians come in and they check out his steel and they say, hey, that's the Imperial mark on it. This is steel that they stole from us and that they melted down and made into these steel bars. And how can you help out someone that obviously has a connection with the Imperials that drove us into hiding? And you get this kind of short fight in the Covert. And I love certain things about this fight because you've got this elite infantry guy. He comes in, he basically yells at the Mandalorian, starts fighting. The armorer is just sitting there. And you can get so much out of this scene. The armorer is just sitting there and she does nothing. She doesn't jump up. She doesn't shout at them to begin with. She just kind of is dealing with the steel while they kind of fight and they horseplay a little bit. And then she yells at essentially both of them, but primarily the heavy infantryman, and says, hey, you can't call somebody a coward. The Empire is no more. We don't have any cowards in the Mandalorian race or way of life because this was something that they chose to kind of go into hiding, to be prey whenever they make appearances out there, and to also hunt for a living and to bring their hunted goods back to support the clan. And the last thing that she winds up saying is, have you ever removed your helmet, and has anyone ever removed it from you? And he says no. The Mandalorian, our main character, says no. And she basically says, okay, then you're a Mandalorian. This is the way, which you can see repeated throughout this episode. And it's unclear what it means exactly in that context, but it clearly means by the time you get to the end of this episode, it means that Mandalorians stick together. They stand by each other. If you follow the path, if you follow the way of the Mandalorian, then we're going to defend each other like a family against everyone in the outside world. And that's going to come up at the end of the episode, but I will tell you what's really nice about this episode is that you watch that scene and you don't fully understand exactly what that means in that context. You obviously understand that the armorer is offering support to our lead character, the Mandalorian, but you don't fully understand exactly what happened there, how it means what it means, but that will become apparent at the end of the episode in kind of a surprising moment, but a very fulfilling one. Then the armorer sits down with the Mandalorian again, says, hey, okay, it sounds to me like you've earned a signet, and that because you fought this Mudhorn on this other planet, the signet should be the Mudhorn. The Mandalorian reveals a little bit more about kind of the Mandalorian face, says, hey, I can't take that signet because I was aided by an enemy. And again, you get this kind of short realization just from body movement and kind of body language of he feels bad about calling Baby Yoda the enemy. And the armorer says, hey, why did an enemy help you? And he says, that baby, he didn't know it was my enemy. And she says, okay, well, then we can't use a Mudhorn. You haven't earned your signet yet. You're still a young Mandalorian, whatever that means in the overall kind of Mandalorian race and faith. But I can make whistling birds for you, which is going to become very important. And so she makes these whistling birds. We're not explained exactly what they are. We're only told that they're very rare and you should only use them when you really need to. And then she starts smithing. We get another kind of PTSD flashback, very similar to the one we had when she was making him a pauldron in episode 1. It's clear that when he sits there and he looks into the fire and he watches the smithing action occur, he has these flashbacks to when some enclave that he was in, presumably his parents, hid him and it was attacked by super battle droids. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is, I've talked about the sequel trilogy. I've talked about my issues with those. I've talked about some of the nostalgia baiting, especially in the most recent trailer for The Rise of Skywalker, where you have essentially C-3PO talking to nobody who should really be his friends just based on screen time in the current trilogy, saying, hey, I'm looking at my friends for the last time, things of that nature. And one could accuse The Mandalorian of doing similar nostalgia baiting, that you've got the monster from Jabba's palace, you've got super battle droids now, you've got these various other kind of elements, obviously Boba Fett's armor and things like that, in this show. But where I think it does it so much better than what Disney is currently doing with its movies is that it is built in organically to the plot line. That whatever time frame this would have been in, it seems like it was probably during the Clone Wars or so, or something related to the Clone Wars, that the Mandalorian lost his family. He was attacked by super battle droids, and it makes sense for the super battle droids to appear in that context versus scenes like in The Force Awakens where Finn is just going through random stuff in the Millennium Falcon, hits the chessboard, pulls out the training droid that you saw in A New Hope and things of that nature, where it's just very obvious, where it's like, hey, remember that thing. And so I think The Mandalorian can be accused of certain things here. Absolutely. It's got Yoda, it's got Jawas, it's got sandcrawlers, it's got all this stuff. But I think they have at least tried to build those in as plot elements that are organic to the story they are telling. And so when you see something like a super battle droid in that context, and maybe you could see glimpses of it before in the previous PTSD flashback, if you could, I didn't see it the first time, that they fit in really, really well with the story. So you get this kind of preeminence of story first, nostalgia bait, absolutely, if we can put it in there, because we do want to sell toys. It's Star Wars, absolutely. We want people to be reminded of the times that they really liked the series, but have it be in force for the story that you're trying to tell. He then goes after the smithing. He's got the shiny new armor. He's clearly looking even better than he was before. He goes into the old cantina. He meets with the guildmaster, and he says, hey, give me some work. The guildmaster is pleased to see him. He shows off that he got some steel for putting the client in touch with the Mandalorian. He's very happy. The Mandalorian says, hey, by the way, how many other people did you put on this job? How many other fobs are out there? And he says, everyone had a fob, which I think is a wonderful little plot point, and it makes one of the coolest scenes in this episode. It doesn't make a ton of sense logically to me, because the Mandalorian was given the information of where to go with the fob and then to go find the life form. And while there were a few bounty hunters there, and it made sense in the plot line, it didn't seem like everyone in the cantina or in the guild or in the parsec or whatever you want to frame it as had the directions to go and get this baby. It wasn't just a free-for-all over there. And so I think it makes sense for this episode. It maybe is fudging the details a little bit, because I think it would have been, like Disneyland or something out there if every single bounty hunter in the galaxy or in the parsec, the region here, had this information and could go there and go seek out the Yoda baby. But that being what it said, it's very interesting, again, to see this scene where the Mandalorian isn't actually saying much, but you are getting told a story by what he is doing. And him going in, being rich, getting all this armor, having had his biggest success, presumably of his career, goes in and immediately asks for more work. And certainly in the context of the rest of the episode, you get this concept there that he is trying to distract himself, that he is not thrilled that he has turned over the baby to this Imperial officer. He's not thrilled with how this has all gone on. So he's going to just get on another bounty as quick as possible and just focus on that so he doesn't have to think about what he did. And this is when you start to get into those kind of conversations of what is the title, what does the subtitle of this episode mean? And it seems like at the start that the sin is referring to the fact that he turns over the Yoda baby. And it might mean that. But as we go forward in this episode, the sin can also be when he decides to go back on the guild and go rescue that Yoda baby against all of his instructions and against presumably some oaths that he has taken to the guild. And so you've got that kind of wonderful dichotomy of interpretation, which is always the best kind of titling, in my opinion, when you've got one of these things, is what does the sin mean? And it can mean two things, and that's really very cool. So ultimately, he gets a job. He's going to go hunt down a Mon Calamari Akbar-looking dude, and he gets into his ship, and he goes to leave, and he sees that his joystick doesn't have the little toggle on the top because the baby Yoda was playing with it, and he thinks, and the camera obviously doesn't have any face to focus on. It just kind of focuses on him for a long beat, and then he turns off the ship, and you know at that point that he's made his choice. And you get the strong impression as you're watching this that in this series, that is the moment. That is the turning point for this character, where he was on a path. He was going to be a Mandalorian. He was clearly relatively young in the trade. He didn't have a signet, whatever that might mean for his faith or his religion or whatever else. But now is the time where he has actually said, hey, I am going to turn on the guild, the bounty hunters guild that I have been working for, because this isn't all right with me. And we still don't have a lot of detail as to why that might be. Basically, all we have is that we can link it to his post-traumatic stress remembrances of being a foundling, and that he presumably equates that experience of being hidden, being a child, being uncomfortable and unsafe, and sees that in the Yoda baby and wants to take it on for himself. That's really all we've got right now. Hopefully we'll get a little bit more character detail as we go on. We're not even halfway through the series or the season yet, but he decides to go. And so then we see him scoping out the location where the Yoda baby is being kept. We get some good little lore beats. You know, I talked at the top of this video about mystery, and even though it's a story that makes sense and doesn't have really that subversion of expectation, they still have some good mysteries. And you get this kind of baby lore as he's highlighting the Werner Herzog character and the Dr. Pershing character, and you get these little bits of lore. They say, extract the necessary material from the Yoda baby, and then Dr. Pershing actually winds up saying, he specifically ordered us to bring it back alive. So you've got two kind of components that they are trying to take out, probably force powers from Baby Yoda, and that someone else is actually above them and has asked them to bring the Yoda baby back alive. And to me, that's a good mystery. Those are two little components of this cute little Cupid doll character, and you get still a little bit more, but not enough to fully understand what's happening with the story. We can kind of posit now that maybe there's an Imperial that's looking for these powers. Maybe there's something else. Maybe it's essentially two different things that are happening at the same time because one body wants them alive, and Werner Herzog seems to be doing something that maybe isn't part of his orders in extracting material from the baby. And you get all this really cool kind of concepting just in that 10-second scene, which I really love when you can have that economy of narrative, when you can have that economy of screenwriting. The Mandalorian then goes in and rescues the baby. We can talk about this. This is some good action. This is some really well kind of photographed fighting and sequences. But ultimately what happens is the Mandalorian goes in, he fights some stormtroopers, he finds Yoda, the baby Yoda, unconscious in some kind of machine. He asks Dr. Pershing what was done to it. He said, hey, I saved it. He would have been dead if it weren't for me. Which is another interesting beat. That Dr. Pershing character is likely to get some more color as we go on through the season as well, and that'll be really interesting. But ultimately, the Mandalorian gets trapped while he's trying to take the baby out. He kind of leans over, he hits the button on his wrist, and the whistling birds turn out to be these kind of homing micro-missile things that hit all the stormtroopers. And it, once again, tells a small little story, that it was because he wasn't willing to take on that signet. That if he had, if he had that he felt he didn't deserve, if he had taken on the signet anyway, he wouldn't have had those whistling birds. He probably would have lost, presumably, in that circumstance. And you get this tiny little story just with the choices that he's made, that he was willing to forego the signet, which would presumably have been a good thing for his advancement, and he got the whistling birds instead. And those are ultimately what saved him at the end of the day. As he rescues the baby, you then get one of my favorite scenes in the episode, which is all the fobs in the cantina going off. Everybody's pager essentially goes off and says, hey, the baby's on the move. Go get the baby. And I think it's a really, really cool scene just in terms of it being evocative, almost like out of a comic book. And one of the things that jumped out at me while I was watching this scene was how much it felt like the latest John Wick. Now, I don't know if you watched the John Wick movies, and I don't want to spoil anything about them for you if you are interested in them and you haven't seen them. But ultimately, John Wick is an assassin, very similar to a bounty hunter in the Star Wars landscape. And through the course of his movies, basically, he makes decisions that go against some of the organizations that he works for. And so you get those kinds of scenes where these organizations say, all right, now you have to go after John Wick, which is ultimately what's happening here. And again, I thought to myself, okay, that's the rest of the series right there. Oh, the Mandalorian's going to be on the run. All these other bounty hunters are going to come after him. You've got the episode of the week format as different bounty hunters come and attack him. That's all going to work. Again, I was wrong, because the very next scene of the episode, as the Mandalorian is escaping to his ship, is all those bounty hunters from the cantina basically in the streets, and the guild leader standing at the end of the street saying, hey, Mandalorian, put that baby down. This isn't how we operate in the Bounty Hunters Guild. And so you actually have all of that I was projecting to the rest of the season appear right at the end of this episode. And where you thought maybe the main fighting was the Mandalorian getting the baby, nope, the main fighting is actually now, because as he engages with these bounty hunters, he decides that he's going to fight his way out. Just like in episode 1 where he said, we're going to shoot our way out. That's what he decides to do. And again, you get some fun elements here. There are things that I don't like about action movies where you have kind of boring firefights, where nothing interesting happens, what some other people might call gimmicks. But here in The Mandalorian, every single fight that he has been involved in has some kind of extra hook. And you have narrative thoughts that go into this fight. In this particular case, you've got these elements of absolutely Westerns. You've got people on the roofs. You've got people on the kind of downstairs side of things. But you also have these elements where he sees a hover cart with a droid, and he gets in and he slides with the hover cart after threatening the droid with death. Droids are very interesting in the Star Wars universe, especially in the Disney Star Wars universe, because there are these concepts of sentience with the droids, and it's becoming a little bit uncomfortable that you can threaten a droid in that fashion. This same issue kind of popped up with Solo, and so I don't know exactly that Disney has a great handle on what droids are in the Star Wars universe. We're going to leave that for a minute because it's not really that important to this analysis, but I did find it interesting that he essentially threatens the droid. The droid says, no, I'm not going to move the hover cart. He threatens to fire at it, and the droid decides to do it. So there is some kind of self-preservation mechanism there, which is interesting. But you get these kind of cool little beats where he's sliding on the hover cart. Ultimately, it doesn't work out for him, and he is totally surrounded. He's going to lose this battle. This actually appears in all of the episodes of The Mandalorian so far. It's one of the reasons that I keep saying that he's young in his career, is that essentially he's losing most of these battles, or at least he's coming into dire circumstances in episode 1, in episode 2, now in episode 3, and ultimately something saves him. In the last episode, it was the Yoda baby. In this episode, it's all over. He's decided he's just going to stare at the Yoda baby and reflect on his life, whatever it might be. Again, we're looking at a helmet when this all happens. And then out of the side alley or out of the main street, the entire Mandalorian covert comes out on jetpacks with some really cool music, starts fighting all the bounty hunters. Just a very, very big moment, a very Star Warsian moment from the movies in this little bit of episode of this Mandalorian TV show. Absolutely fantastically done. And again, I'm sitting there going, oh, I had thought when he made this decision to go steal the baby, he was betraying not just the Bounty Hunters Guild, but also his Mandalorian covert. And that is, in fact, not the case. They're actually making a distinction in this episode between the Bounty Hunters Guild and the Mandalorians. And so the Mandalorians come out, and you see the heavy infantry guy come out in his defense. The heavy infantry guy will also be the guy that salutes him at the end of the episode. And you get this notion with, this is the way that the Mandalorians might not agree with what our Mandalorian, the main character of this show, actually wound up doing in this episode. That it probably isn't a great idea to go against an Imperial officer or an ex-Imperial officer, steal this baby, cause all this trouble. And he tells him, hey, you're going to have to move the covert now because everybody knows that you're here. And they say, hey, this is the way. The Mandalorians are a family, and even if we disagree with you, nobody else has the right to shoot at you. We're going to protect you. We're going to stick in this together against the world. And that's a very cool notion. And it's a very interesting one because it does set up this kind of world building and this lore. Again, not in being told it in a narrative form or in a prologue or in things like that, but in actually the choices that are made and how the organizations wind up coming up at odds against each other on something like this. And also, hey, jetpacks are cool, which now we know because this is being taped a little bit late. J.J. Abrams also agrees with, as the main characters in The Rise of Skywalker wind up saying that they fly now in respective jet pack stormtroopers. Now, interestingly enough, The Mandalorian is well before the events of Rise of Skywalker. We're going to leave that alone. We're not going to try to get into any of that. But suffice it to say, the Mandalorians, they fly now as well. And it certainly is interesting that the Mandalorians don't wind up having a conversation with him about his mistake, don't wind up shooting at him in the course of this episode, although we can certainly imagine that if the Armorer and the other Mandalorians are going to be characters going forward into the future, that, hey, there might be a conversation in The Mandalorian, our main character's future, because they probably don't agree with this course of action, but that doesn't matter in this specific instance where you've got the Bounty Hunters Guild attacking one of their own. Finally, the last beat of this episode is that the guild leader Grief comes into his ship. He's actually hiding there, and the Mandalorian fights him and wins. Again, you've got another cool beat here. It's not just a quick draw firefight. The Mandalorian actually turns on some ventilation in his ship so that the guild leader can't see him, shoots him in the chest, and flies away. Now, the interesting beat there, of course, is that the guild leader winds up surviving. Why? Because the bullet hit the Bible. Or in this case, the blaster bolt hit the Beskar steel that was in his pocket. And again, you get all of these kind of story beats that are related to the choices that the Mandalorian had made. If the Mandalorian had not succeeded or had not taken on the task originally, yes, we'd get a totally different story, but also this particular guildmaster wouldn't have that steel in his pocket. So everything comes back to the actions that the Mandalorian took. He is our protagonist, and the story does revolve around him in a way that maybe you don't see in some less tight scripting. So you get all of these really cool beats as the Mandalorian flies away with Baby Yoda, cut to black. And we don't know where he's going. We don't know where his plan is. We don't know where Baby Yoda is going to come into the plot anymore. We don't know who's after him. We don't know why they're after him. And again, as I said at the top of this video, it really feels like Chapter 1, 2, and 3 were the first Mandalorian movie. And that maybe 4, 5, and 6 are going to be the second Mandalorian movie. And this is plotted out in a way that currently is very gratifying. Now, like with anything else, when you've got a sequel, which I think Episode 4 will wind up feeling like, you have a risk that it's maybe not as good as the original. And so you have that kind of risk being taken, I think, between Episode 3 and Episode 4. And it will be very interesting to see where they go. And again, like I said in this video, I was very impressed by the fact that they didn't stretch out a bunch of these plot points. I had said at the end of Episode 2, okay, Mandalorian's going to go back. He's going to have second thoughts about turning over Baby Yoda. He's going to go on the run. That's going to be that. And yes, that's ultimate where he's left at the end of this episode, but we got through so much of the plot that I thought was going to be just standard and stretched out across the season in this episode alone that I think it opens up the door and the window, or whatever other metaphor that you want to use, to a whole universe of possibilities going forward. And finally, as I've said in the rest of this video, it's really nice to have a story that can have surprises like the Mandalorian's coming out, because I don't think that I assumed, at least personally, that they would be there and available to back up the Mandalorian after he made these issues for them in this city and on this planet, that you have that level of surprise, but that when you think about it and you reflect on what was said and the scenes that you saw, it makes sense. It's not a subversion. It's a surprise. And there's a difference there. And I think it's the difference between telling a really good story and telling a story that is just kind of self-involved and self-important. The Mandalorian isn't that. And to some, that's not going to be enough. It's a very standard kind of heroic pulp novel-esque story about a bounty hunter, now a bounty hunter on the run. That's been our postmortem of Episode 3 of The Mandalorian, The Sin. Please join us relatively soon, I would imagine, for our postmortem on Episode 4, whatever subtitle that might be. And check out the rest of the channel if you're interested in this, business, law, video games, or anything else that we discuss. We'll catch you on the next postmortem. See you then.